Normandy, France. May 1944. A German soldier stops a young woman on a country road. She is on a bicycle. There is a wicker basket up front, a loose dress, windswept hair. Nothing about her looks dangerous. She looks like any other French farm girl out for an afternoon ride. He waves his hand. She breaks. He speaks to her in German. She answers in broken French and wide eyes. "Pardon, je ne comprends pas." He looks her up and down, her clothes, her basket, the small cloth bag hooked on the handlebars. He leans in and rummages through the basket. He finds a loaf of bread. He finds a pair of worn gloves. And there, right on top, a ball of wool with 2 knitting needles poking out. He picks up the needles, turns them over in his hands for a moment, and sets them back down. He waves her through. She nods, says "Merci," and pedals away, calm as Sunday morning. He never checked inside the needles. If he had, he would have found a tiny silk square, no bigger than a postage stamp, rolled so, tight it fit inside the hollow bamboo shaft. On that silk, written in a code only London could break, were the critical transmission instructions for coordinating the largest military invasion in the history of the world. D-Day was coming, and this woman, this 22-year-old girl on a bicycle in a faded dress, was the one keeping the lines open between the French resistance and Allied command. Her name was Phyllis Latour. And if you have never heard of her before today, that tells you everything you need to know about how history treats the women who helped win this war. Stay with me, because this story is going to blow your mind. I have been researching World War II spies for a long time, and Phyllis Latour Doyle is one of those stories that you finish reading and you just sit there staring at the wall. Because what this woman did in 1944, the risks she took every single day, the sheer nerve it took to do what she did, it is almost impossible to believe it actually happened. But it did. And I think you deserve to hear it told the right way. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning. Phyllis Latour was born on April 8, 1921, in Cognac, in the Charente region of southwest France. Now, right there, that detail matters. She was not British, she was not American, she was Franco-British, the daughter of a French mother and a British father, and she grew up moving between 2 worlds, 2 languages, 2 cultures. Her father died when she was still very young. He was gone before she really got a chance to know him, and her mother, left on her own with a small child in interwar Europe, did the best she could to hold things together. Phyllis grew up split between France and South Africa and England, and because of that, she never fully belonged anywhere. But she spoke French like a native. She moved through French streets, French villages, French markets with the ease and the accent of someone who had been born and raised there and never left. That was, as you will see, going to matter enormously. By the time the war broke out in 1939, Phyllis was 18 years old and restless. She was the kind of woman who did not sit still well. She had already earned a pilot's license, which, for a woman in the early 1940s, was not exactly a common thing to do. She liked speed, she liked machines, she liked the idea that the world was bigger than the town she was standing in. When Britain went to war, she did not wait to be asked. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF, and she was good at it. She worked as a wireless operator, learning the rhythms of Morse code, the patience it takes to sit at a transmitter for hours, the mental discipline of keeping your signal clean and clear under pressure. Think about what that training gives you. You are sitting in a room with headphones on, translating dots and dashes into words, sending words back as dots and dashes, staying calm, staying accurate, staying focused, while everyone around you is in a state of controlled panic because the war is all around you. That kind of work teaches you something about yourself. It teaches you what you are made of. It also caught the attention of the Special Operations Executive. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little more about what that WWII training actually looked like, because I think it matters. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force was not a soft posting. These women worked in signals, in meteorology, in aircraft operations and maintenance. They decoded messages, they tracked enemy aircraft, they worked in radar stations in the middle of nowhere with bombs falling and not enough sleep. Phyllis was specifically trained in radio operation, which meant sitting at a set for hours, interpreting incoming Morse at high speed, sending outgoing messages cleanly and accurately, and doing all of it calmly while the world around you was quite possibly on fire. She was stationed in England during this period, and the stations where she worked were not always safe. German bombers targeted RAF and WAAF installations regularly. You learned quickly that you worked in the middle of danger. You learned that it did not stop you. You kept your headset on, and you listened. She was good at it. Her supervisors noted her accuracy, her composure, her ability to maintain a clean signal under conditions that made less steady operators fall apart. She was marked as someone with exceptional ability in this area. And somewhere, somebody in the intelligence community noticed her file. Now, if you have been watching this channel for a while, you know who the SOE was. For those of you who are new, here is the short version. The Special Operations Executive was Winston Churchill's secret army. He set it up in 1940 with one simple instruction: set Europe ablaze. The SOE recruited men and women from across the Allied nations, trained them in everything from silent killing to safe-cracking to radio operation, and then dropped them behind enemy lines to work with local resistance movements, gather intelligence, and generally make the German occupation as miserable as possible. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. SOE agents operated alone or in tiny cells, surrounded by an enemy that was actively hunting them, with no uniform, no official status, and no protection from the Geneva Convention if they were captured. If the Gestapo caught you, you were counted as a spy, and spies were not taken prisoner. They were tortured and executed. More than half the SOE's wireless operators in France were captured. Let that number sit with you for a moment. More than half. The average life expectancy of a radio operator in the field was 6 weeks. Phyllis volunteered anyway. She was recruited by SOE's F section, the French section, the one responsible for operations across occupied France. She went through the full training program, and I want to spend a moment here because people tend to gloss over the training and jump straight to the field, but the training is where you understand what these women were actually being asked to do and how seriously the SOE took the preparation. First came the preliminary schools, country houses in England, where instructors assessed whether recruits had the basic qualities needed for field work. Could they lie convincingly? Could they maintain a cover story under pressure? Could they think clearly when they were exhausted and frightened? Not everyone passed. Some people were sent back to their regular postings, and the SOE never told them exactly why. You either had it or you did not. Then came paramilitary training, usually in the Scottish Highlands, where recruits learned fieldcraft, silent movement, how to read terrain, how to evade pursuit, how to cross a border without being noticed. They learned to fight with their hands. They learned explosives. They learned how to live off the land if they had to. They made parachute jumps, day jumps at first, and then night jumps, learning to fall correctly, to roll when you hit the ground, to collapse your chute in seconds before anyone could see where you had come down. Then came the finishing schools, where they refined their cover identities, their backstories, their accents, where they were interrogated by instructors posing as Gestapo officers, screamed at, kept awake, threatened, pressured. The point was not to simulate a real interrogation exactly. The point was to find out whether a recruit would crack before they were ever in the field, because if you were going to crack, the SOE needed to know that now, in a controlled environment, not in a Gestapo cellar in Paris with actual people's lives depending on your silence. Phyllis went through all of it. She went through the preliminary assessment and passed. She went through the paramilitary training in Scotland and passed. She went through the finishing school and passed. Her French was perfect. Her cover story was airtight. Her Morse code speed was among the best in her group. She was assigned the code name Genevieve. And on the first day of May 1944, 5 weeks before D-Day, she stepped out of a plane over Normandy and fell into the darkness. Right here, I just want to pause for 1 second and ask you something. Have you ever jumped out of a plane? Even in the daytime, even with a professional instructor strapped to your back, even knowing you are going to land in a wide-open field in a free country, it is still terrifying for most people. Now imagine doing it at night, over enemy territory, alone, in civilian clothes, with a radio set and a silk code hidden in your luggage, knowing that if the German patrol on the ground spots your parachute, or if anyone on the ground talks, you will be arrested and almost certainly executed. That is what Phyllis Latour did on May 1st, 1944. Alone, in the dark, trusting that the reception committee waiting below was actually who they said they were and not a Gestapo trap. The woman had nerves of absolute steel. She landed safely. The reception team was genuine. Within days, she was embedded in the Normandy countryside, living under a cover identity, riding a bicycle through the lanes and fields of a region that was about to become the center of the entire war. Her cover story was that she was a young Frenchwoman from elsewhere in the country who had come to the area to help with agricultural work. In 1944, labor shortages in the countryside were common enough that a young woman showing up to help on farms did not raise eyebrows. She had a false identity card, false papers, a false name. She had rehearsed her backstory until she could recite it under pressure without hesitation. Where she was born, where she went to school, what her family did, why she was here, where she was going. Every detail consistent, every timeline solid. If someone asked about a street in the town she claimed to be from, she could describe it. If someone asked about local events, she had plausible answers. The SOE had been thorough, and Phyllis was ready. One of the first things she did after arriving was establish a bicycle routine. This sounds trivial, but it was actually one of the most important things she did for her long-term survival. In a village or small town under occupation, people notice patterns. If you have a reason to be on the road every day, and people expect to see you cycling through, you become part of the landscape. You become ordinary. The German soldiers at checkpoints started recognizing her face, and familiarity, counterintuitively, is protective. A face they have seen before is less likely to be stopped than a face they have never seen. So she built the routine deliberately and early. Cycling, knitting basket in the front, same roads, same times, same cheerful nod at the checkpoint. Boring, harmless, invisible, because it is easy to hear the word spy and picture someone in a glamorous outfit slipping through shadow-filled corridors. The reality was completely different. Phyllis Latour spent most of her time doing what looked like nothing special, riding her bicycle, knitting, visiting farmhouses, having cups of ersatz coffee with elderly women and local farmers. She had built a cover story as a young Frenchwoman working with the local community, harmless, ordinary, forgettable. A girl with a knitting basket. Not a threat to anyone. But the knitting basket was the key to everything. Here is how her code system worked, and when I tell you this, you are going to understand why it was genius. Every SOE wireless operator had to memorize or carry their encryption codes. These codes were what allowed London to read the messages they sent, and what allowed the operator to decode messages coming back from London. Early in the war, agents sometimes carried code books, but those were obvious. If a German searched you and found a code book, it was over. If you memorized the codes, they were safe from searches, but vulnerable to memory failure under stress, injury, or exhaustion. The SOE's solution was the Silk Code. Instructions and code keys were printed on a tiny square of silk, light, flexible, almost weightless. You could sew it into a hem, swallow it, or, in Phyllis Latour's case, roll it into a tight cylinder and slip it inside the hollow shaft of a bamboo knitting needle. That is it. That is the whole trick. And it is so brilliantly simple that it almost makes you laugh, except that it worked every single time. The Germans searched her 3 separate times. 3 times they stopped her, went through her things, looked at her needles, and found nothing. Because nobody searches a knitting needle. Nobody takes a ball of yarn apart fiber by fiber. Nobody suspects the girl with the mittens in progress draped across her lap of being the most dangerous radio operator in Normandy. And before we go any further, let me just say something here. If you are enjoying this story, if you want to keep hearing about the women who changed the course of history and never got the credit they deserved, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button. It is free. It takes 2 seconds, and it means you will never miss one of these stories. There are more women like Phyllis Latour, stories that your history teacher never told you, stories that need to be heard. Hit subscribe, and you will be here for all of them. Now, back to Normandy, 1944. The region Phyllis was operating in was not quiet territory. Normandy in the spring of 1944 was full of German troops. The Wehrmacht had been fortifying the French coastline for 2 years as part of what they called the Atlantic Wall, a massive chain of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and barriers stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. The Germans knew an Allied invasion was coming. They just did not know exactly where or when. And so the entire northern French coast was crawling with soldiers, checkpoints, patrols, and Gestapo informants. Every stranger was a potential agent. Every unusual pattern of movement was investigated. And the German signals intelligence units, the ones with the direction-finding vans that could triangulate a radio transmission and locate the source within a kilometer or 2 if you stayed on the air long enough, were some of the most sophisticated in the world. Phyllis knew this. She had been trained on it. Every time she set up her transmitter and began sending, she was in a race against those vans. The longer she transmitted, the more time they had to locate her. The professional recommendation from the SOE was to keep transmissions under 20 minutes. Phyllis often managed 10. She would set up in a different farmhouse, a different barn, a different field, every single time. She never sent from the same location twice in a row. She kept her sets hidden in multiple locations and moved them constantly. She knew the tricks the direction-finding teams used, and she used her own tricks right back at them. Change the frequency mid-transmission, if possible. Keep the message short and tight, nothing unnecessary. Get in, send, get out. And then get back on the bicycle with the knitting needle and ride away like she did not have a care in the world. The cover worked because Phyllis was extraordinary at playing ordinary. She had a gift for it. Intelligence officers who worked with her later described her as someone who could walk into any situation and disappear into it. She did not draw attention to herself. She did not fidget or look nervous. She made eye contact with German soldiers at checkpoints and said the right things in the right accent with the right amount of mild irritation, like any French woman would feel at being stopped on her way home. She looked them in the eye. She made them see a girl with yarn, not a spy with codes. The first search happened just a few weeks after she arrived. A patrol stopped her on a road outside a small village near Bayeux. Two soldiers, routine checkpoint. They asked her where she was going, what she was carrying. She answered patiently in French. They went through her basket. They found the bread, the wool, the needles. One of them held up a needle and looked at it, looked at her. She watched him, waiting. He turned it over once and put it back. They waved her through. She cycled half a kilometer, turned off the road into a lane between two hedgerows, and stopped for a moment. She said later that she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to stop and breathe, and then she was riding again. No time for anything more than that. There was work to do, because the work in those weeks before D-Day was critical. The Allied High Command, coordinated through General Eisenhower's headquarters, was running multiple deception operations simultaneously to keep the Germans guessing about where the invasion would land. Agents in the field, wireless operators like Phyllis, were sending intelligence about German troop positions, fortification strengths, supply routes, and movement patterns. Every message she sent was a piece of that puzzle. London needed to know which beaches were most heavily defended. They needed to know where the panzer divisions were positioned. They needed to know if the Germans had been fooled by the deceptions or if they had figured out that Normandy was the real target. Phyllis sent dozens of messages in those weeks. She covered hundreds of kilometers on her bicycle, visiting resistance contacts, gathering intelligence, and then transmitting it in compressed bursts while someone watched the road. The network she was part of was called Scientist, and it stretched across a broad swath of Normandy, farmers, teachers, local merchants, people who had been living under German occupation for 4 years and were ready to help end it. Phyllis was the thread that connected all of them to London. Without her radio, they were isolated. With it, they were part of something much bigger than themselves. Let me tell you a little bit about what those resistance contacts actually looked like on the ground, because again, this is the part that gets romanticized, and I think it deserves to be seen clearly. The Normandy resistance in 1944 was not a slick organization. It was a ragged collection of ordinary people, each of them putting their lives on the line based on nothing more than a commitment to getting the Germans out of their country. There was a farmer who let Phyllis use his loft to transmit from. There was a bakery owner who passed messages disguised as bread orders. There was a school teacher who rode his own bicycle around the countryside, gathering information about German troop movements and writing it in tiny handwriting on sheets of paper that he folded and hid behind a loose stone in a wall that Phyllis knew about and checked on her rounds. These were not trained intelligence operatives. They were people who had decided, at enormous personal risk, that they were not going to simply watch the occupation happen around them. Every one of them could have been arrested at any moment. Every one of them had family members who could have been taken as reprisals if they were caught. The Germans were not gentle about resistance activity. When they found a network, they did not just arrest the operatives. They arrested families, friends, neighbors. They burned farms. The price of resistance was paid not just by the people involved, but by everyone near them. And yet these people did it anyway. And Phyllis Latour was their lifeline to Allied command. She was the reason their intelligence actually reached the people who could use it to end the occupation faster. She was also maintaining her cover in the community. She attended local events. She chatted with neighbors. She seemed to everyone around her to be nothing more than what she appeared to be, a young woman getting through the occupation the same way. Everyone else was, one day at a time. The farm wives in the area liked her. She would sometimes actually knit while she chatted with them, needles clicking, wool pooling in her lap, the codes rolled up inside the bamboo, right there, 3 feet from whoever she was speaking to. It was brazen, it was brilliant, it was the only way to survive. The second search was more serious. This one was not a routine checkpoint. A German military patrol had been tipped off, probably by an informant, that there was resistance activity in a particular village. They were doing house-to-house searches of anyone coming in or out. Phyllis rode straight into it. She could have turned around. She could have found another route. But turning around when you reach a checkpoint looks exactly as suspicious as it is. She kept going. This time the search was more thorough. 2 soldiers plus a sergeant, and the sergeant was the kind of man who did not smile, who moved through every search with the slow patience of someone who has found people hiding things before and expects to find them again. He went through her basket piece by piece. He shook the bread loaf. He unrolled the gloves. He picked up each knitting needle individually and held it up to look at it in the light. Phyllis stood there watching him, not staring, just present. Calm, slightly bored, the way a local woman who gets searched 4 times a week learns to be. He put the needle down. He moved on. Years later, a reporter asked her what she was thinking in that moment, watching a German sergeant hold a bamboo tube that contained the codes that could get her shot. She thought about it for a moment, and then she said she was mainly focused on making sure her face looked right, because the face is everything in that situation. If your face shows fear, it is over. Not because they can prove anything, but because they will hold you, and if they hold you, they will eventually find something. So she made her face look bored, and then she rode away again. Now, I want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough in most accounts of Phyllis Latour's story, and that is what this kind of sustained tension actually does to a human being. Because people hear these stories and they think about the searches, the close calls, the dramatic moments, but what they do not think about is the in-between, the hours, the days, the weeks of knowing that any person you talk to could be an informant. Any neighbor who sees you leaving at an unusual hour could report you. Any German soldier who happens to recognize you from a previous checkpoint might remember you next time and decide to take you in for questioning, just to see what you know. The sustained psychological weight of living like that is almost impossible to describe if you have not experienced it. It is not the big dramatic moment that breaks most people. It is the endless, grinding, every single day for months accumulation of knowing that one small mistake could mean your death. Phyllis did not break. She kept going. She kept transmitting. She kept riding her bicycle down roads lined with German soldiers and kept looking bored about it. And then June 6th happened. Let me tell you, if you love this kind of history, if you love the stories of the everyday people who were right there in the middle of the biggest events of the 20th century, you are in exactly the right place. This channel exists for people like you, people who know that real history is not the stuff in the textbooks. Real history is this: a 22-year-old woman on a bicycle, hiding codes in a knitting needle, transmitting intelligence that helped coordinate the liberation of Europe. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Tap that button, tap the bell, and make sure you get every story like this one as soon as it drops. Stories like this deserve to be heard. Now, let us get back to June 6th, D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. In the early hours of that morning, more than 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and a dozen other Allied nations began crossing the English Channel in the largest amphibious assault ever attempted in human history. More than 5,000 ships, more than 13,000 aircraft. The beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and sword would see some of the most intense and bloody fighting of the entire war. By midnight on June 6th, the Allies had established a foothold on French soil, but the cost had been staggering. Thousands of young men died on those beaches. Some of them never even made it to the sand. But here is what most people forget. The invasion did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a context of months of preparation, deception, intelligence gathering, and coordination that involved hundreds of agents across occupied France. Phyllis Latour was one of them. From the moment the first wave of troops hit the beaches, she was transmitting. The resistance needed to know where German reinforcements were moving. The Allies needed to know which roads were blocked, which bridges were guarded, which divisions were being redirected to Normandy from other parts of France. Every hour of those first desperate days, intelligence was flowing both ways across the radio frequencies. And Phyllis was one of the nodes in that network, one of the people making it work. She transmitted in conditions that would have broken lesser people. During D-Day and the days that followed, the entire Normandy region was in chaos. German forces were being repositioned constantly. Patrols were doubled and then tripled. The SS and the Gestapo were conducting sweeps through villages, arresting people on suspicion, torturing resistance contacts to find the radio operators they knew had to be out there somewhere. The direction-finding vans were working overtime. I want you to understand what a direction-finding van actually meant in practice, because this is the technology that killed more SOE wireless operators than anything else. The Germans had mobile units, vans equipped with directional antennas that could be driven through an area while a radio transmission was active. As the van moved and the antenna rotated, the operators inside could measure the strength of the signal from different angles and triangulate the approximate location of the transmitter. 2 or 3 vans working in coordination could narrow a signal down to a specific block, sometimes a specific building, within a matter of minutes. The operator had to be fast, had to complete the transmission quickly, and had to be gone before the vans could converge on the location. If you were still at your set when they arrived, you were finished. Phyllis knew this. She had been briefed on it in training, and she had thought about it carefully before she ever arrived in Normandy. Her solution was mobility and brevity. Keep moving, keep it short, never transmit from anywhere twice, and always have a way out of wherever you were transmitting from that did not involve going back the way you came. And during D-Day week, when the vans were out in force, and the Gestapo was running on adrenaline and every lead was being followed up immediately, she was tighter and faster than ever. 7 minutes, 8 minutes, pack and go. Phyllis kept moving. She changed locations every single day during that period, sometimes twice a day. She sometimes transmitted from the open countryside, crouched in a hedgerow with her set propped on a stone wall, a contact watching the road from 50 meters away while she sent. She sometimes used a loft in a barn, the radio antenna draped out through a gap in the boards, everything disassembled and hidden in a feed sack before the farmer's family came up for the evening milking. She never stayed long. She never got comfortable. 10 minutes, 12 minutes, send the message, pack the set, and go. And through all of it, the code stayed safe in the knitting needle. The third search was the most dangerous. It happened in the weeks after D-Day, when German security operations in Normandy were at their most intense. Phyllis had been traveling between 2 contacts when she was stopped at a checkpoint that had not been there the day before. 3 German soldiers, a transport truck, a makeshift barrier across the road. No way around it without turning back, and turning back was not an option. This time they took her off the bicycle. They had her stand to the side while they went through everything she was carrying. Not just the basket, everything. They went through her bag piece by piece. They shook out every item of clothing she had. They picked up the knitting project she had been working on and unrolled a section of the wool, looking for wires, looking for paper, looking for anything that should not be there. One soldier picked up the bamboo needle and held it horizontally, looking down the length of it as if checking to see whether it was straight. He was 6 inches away from the silk square with the codes on it. He put the needle down. They held her for almost 2 hours at that checkpoint, going through anything they could think to go through, and in the end they found nothing, because the one place they did not think to look was the one place she had hidden everything. They let her go. Phyllis remounted her bicycle and rode away for the 3rd time. 3 searches. 3 times the codes were right there in front of the Germans. 3 times they missed it. She later said very plainly that she was not particularly frightened during those searches. She said that she had decided very early on that fear was not useful in those situations, and so she had trained herself out of it as much as possible. She found that if she focused entirely on what she was doing, on projecting exactly the right level of calm and ordinariness, the fear sort of stepped back and let her work. She said it was less like courage and more like discipline, like a pilot who does not panic during turbulence, not because they are not aware of the danger, but because panic is not compatible with flying the plane. She was always flying the plane. And let me add one more dimension to this, because I think about the radio itself a lot when I think about Phyllis Latour. The radio was not just her tool, it was her connection. In the middle of occupied France, surrounded by an enemy who would have executed her on the spot if they had known what she was doing, the radio set was her thread back to London, to Allied command, to the people who knew who she was and what she was doing, and were depending on her. Every time she connected, she was briefly not alone. Every time the signal came back from London, clean and clear through her headset, she was briefly part of something larger than the narrow, dangerous world she was living in. And then she packed the set and rode away and was alone again. I think that is one of the aspects of this kind of work that people do not appreciate enough, the isolation of it. You could not talk to anyone about what you were really doing. You could not share your fears. You could not admit to doubt or exhaustion. You were always performing, always inside the cover identity, always carrying the full weight of the mission and the knowledge of what failure would mean. The radio was the one place where you got to be real. 10 minutes of reality inside a life built on fiction, and then back on the bicycle. I want to talk for a minute about who Phyllis Latour was as a person, because she was not just a spy. She was a full human being with a life, and that context matters. She had grown up moving between worlds, and that displacement gave her something that you cannot train into a person. It gave her the ability to belong anywhere and nowhere at the same time. She was comfortable with uncertainty. She was comfortable with not being fully known by the people around her. She had been doing a version of that her whole life, being the girl who did not quite fit any single community entirely, the Anglo-French girl in Africa, the colonial girl in England, the French woman in occupied Normandy. She had spent decades reading rooms and adapting. The SOE turned that lifelong skill into something with a mission. She also had a sense of humor that comes through clearly in the interviews she gave much later in life. She talked about her wartime work with a kind of matter-of-fact directness that was partly generational. She was from a generation that did not dramatize things, and partly, you suspect, genuinely the way she processed it. She was not hiding the weight of what she had done, but she was not theatricalizing it either. She had done what needed doing, and then she had gotten on with living. That, more than anything, tells you something important about the kind of person she was. She was also very, very good at her job. In the span of roughly 4 months, from her arrival in May to the liberation of her area in late summer, Phyllis sent more than 200 messages to London. 200. In a region saturated with German forces under constant threat of detection, while living under a false identity, while cycling hundreds of miles to gather the intelligence she was sending. The SOE assessed her as one of the most effective wireless operators they had in the field. She did not lose a single message, she was never caught, and the silk code in the bamboo needle was never discovered. Now let me tell you about how the liberation actually unfolded in Normandy, because this is the part of the story that often gets compressed or skipped, and it mattered enormously to the people living through it. After D-Day, the fighting in Normandy was not quick. The Germans did not simply retreat. They dug in. They fought for every town, every village, every hedgerow, the bocage, the dense network of hedges and sunken lanes that characterized the Normandy countryside was ideal defensive terrain, and the German military used it expertly. The Allies gained ground slowly, painfully, at enormous cost. For the French civilians caught in the middle and for the resistance fighters supporting the Allies, this period was almost as dangerous as anything that had come before. Phyllis kept transmitting. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Normandy through June and July, her messages shifted in focus. Less about pre-invasion intelligence, more about current troop positions, more about supply lines, more about German defensive positions that the Allies needed to know about before they advanced. She was, in a very real sense, a battlefield intelligence asset, a person providing real-time information that could affect tactical decisions being made in the field, and she was still doing it on a bicycle, with a knitting basket, in a faded dress. When liberation finally reached her area in the late summer of 1944, Phyllis had been in the field for nearly 4 months. She had transmitted more messages than almost anyone else in her circuit. She had survived 3 searches that should have ended her mission and her life. She had ridden, by her own estimate, hundreds of kilometers on rural French roads, carrying the most sensitive intelligence materials in occupied Europe in a knitting needle. Somewhere in those 4 months, one specific thing stands out to me as I read the accounts. There was a period in late June or early July after D-Day, but before the German lines had collapsed, when the Allies were grinding through the Norman bocage and the fighting was intense and close and casualties were brutal. The resistance contacts in Phyllis's network were becoming increasingly anxious. Some of them were pulling back, spooked by the intensity of the German security crackdowns. Others were doubling down, risking more because they could see that the end was near and they wanted to do everything they could to help it arrive faster. The tension in the network was palpable, and through all of it, Phyllis had to keep everybody calm, keep everybody moving, keep the intelligence flowing and the communications tight without breaking cover and without letting anyone's fear bleed into the transmissions that London depended on. She was 23 years old, managing a network of civilian resistance fighters, transmitting intelligence under active enemy surveillance, and doing it all while presenting to the world the face of a bored young woman out for a bicycle ride. 23 years old, and the German occupation ended, the French civilians who had been living under it for 4 years did not react the way they do in the movies, with instant joy and parades and everyone hugging soldiers in the street. Some of that was there, certainly, but for most people the first feeling was something closer to disbelief. 4 years is a long time. 4 years of curfews and food, rationing and soldiers on every corner and informants in every neighborhood and the constant hum of fear. When it was finally over, many people simply could not process it immediately. They had been running on a kind of controlled tension for so long that they did not know how to stop. Phyllis felt something like that too, she said later. Not exactly relief, more like the sudden absence of something that had been filling every moment for so long that you had stopped noticing it was there. And then the absence itself was almost disorienting. She returned to England before the end of 1944. The war in Europe was not over yet, but her specific mission was done. The Normandy circuit had served its purpose. The Allies were advancing through France and eventually Germany. The end was coming. She was 23 years old. For her service, Phyllis Latour was awarded the MBE, the Member of the Order of the British Empire, and the Croix de Guerre, France's military honor for distinguished service in combat. She was also awarded the King's Medal for courage in the cause of freedom. 3 medals for a woman who had spent 4 months in occupied Normandy, sending radio messages while dressed as a girl out for a bicycle ride. Honestly, 3 medals does not feel like enough. But that is the nature of what these women did. The work was secret. The recognition, when it came, was quiet. Some of them never told their families what they had done. Some of them went to their graves without anyone close to them knowing the full story. The SOE was officially dissolved in 1946. Its records were sealed. The women who had served in it went back to their lives. You have come this far in this story, and I think you know by now that this channel is different from the history you learned in school. We dig into the real stories, the ones about real people who made real choices under impossible circumstances. People like Phyllis Latour deserve to be celebrated not just by historians, but by everyone. If this is the kind of content that matters to you, subscribe right now. If you have a friend who loves WWII history, share this with them. It is the best way to keep these stories alive. And leaving a comment with your thoughts means more than you know. Now let us keep going, because the rest of Phyllis's life is just as remarkable in its own way. After the war, Phyllis did something that surprised the people who knew her. She moved on completely. She married a man named Gordon Doyle in 1946, and the two of them built a life together that took them first to Kenya, where they lived for a number of years, and then eventually to New Zealand, where they settled for the long term. She had children, she had a home, she had a garden. She raised a family in the small hours of an ordinary life, thousands of miles from the Normandy lanes where she had once crouched in hedgerows, transmitting intelligence while German direction-finding vans swept the countryside looking for her. Signal. She did not talk about what she had done during the war, not to her neighbors, not in most cases to her children, not to anyone who did not already know. This was partly the culture of the SOE. Operatives were expected to maintain secrecy not just during the war, but after it. But it was also partly Phyllis herself. She was not the kind of person who needed to be recognized for what she had done. She had done it because it needed doing. That was enough. Her husband Gordon died, and she continued to live in New Zealand, quietly, in a community that had no idea what the elderly woman down the road had done in France in 1944. It was only later in her life, as World War II history began to be revisited and as researchers began to look more closely at the SOE's female agents, that Phyllis Latour Doyle started to be recognized publicly for her service. That process of rediscovery was a long one. For decades after the war, the SOE's operations were officially secret. The organization itself had been dissolved in 1946, its records sealed, its agents sworn to continued confidentiality. The official history of the SOE in France was not declassified for years, and even then it was incomplete. Agents had died. Records had been lost or destroyed. Some families had burned letters and photographs on the instructions of the men and women who came home, following protocols that had been drilled into them during training. The secrecy that had kept them alive in the field continued to surround them after the war was over. It was a strange kind of isolation, You had done something extraordinary and dangerous and important, something that had contributed to the end of the most destructive war in human history, and you could not talk about it. You watched the veterans' parades and the memorial services, and you knew that most of what you had done would never appear in any official account. You watched movies about the war, and they looked nothing like what you had actually experienced. You got on with your life because there was no other option. Phyllis did this with what seemed like genuine equanimity. People who knew her in New Zealand described her as cheerful, engaged, interested in the world, not the kind of person who was visibly burdened by the past. But in interviews she gave later in life, there were moments where you could see that the memory of Normandy was still vivid. The smells, the sounds, the particular quality of the light on a French country road in June. The way a bicycle felt under you on cobblestones. Some things do not fade. You just learn to carry them differently. She gave interviews. She spoke carefully and thoughtfully about what she had done, always with that quality of direct clarity and quiet understatement that had apparently been with her from the beginning. When people asked her about the danger, she acknowledged it matter-of-factly. When they asked about the searches, she described them without drama. When they asked how she had managed to keep the silk codes hidden in the knitting needle through 3 German searches, she said quite simply that no one searched a knitting needle because no one would think to. It was the most obvious hiding place in the world precisely because it was so unremarkable, and that, in many ways, was the story of Phyllis Latour in miniature. The most obvious thing in the room that no one ever really looked at. She lived to be 102 years old. Phyllis Latour Doyle died on November 25, 2023, in New Zealand. She was one of the last surviving SOE agents from World War II, and when she died, obituaries ran in newspapers across Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. People who had never known she existed learned her story for the first time. Comments poured in from men and women who said that they had found out what their own grandmothers or great-aunts had done during the war from reading her obituary, that it had opened a door they had not even known was there. 102 years old. Think about that for a moment. She was born in 1921, and she lived to see the 21st century in full swing. She was born before regular commercial air travel existed. She was born before television. She was born before the atomic bomb that would end the Pacific War. She grew up during the Great Depression. She participated in the most destructive conflict in human history. She watched the moon landings, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the Internet, smartphones, streaming video. She saw more changes to the world in her lifetime than most civilizations see in centuries, and through all of it, she had been the girl with the knitting basket, the girl with the codes in the needle, the girl who looked a German sergeant in the eye while he held the bamboo tube containing the secrets that could have gotten her executed and made her face look bored. Now I want to talk about what Phyllis Latour's story actually means beyond the adventure of it, because I think there is something here that goes deeper than just a remarkable wartime tale. We live in a world that is saturated with stories about strength and bravery that look a certain way, big gestures, dramatic confrontations, visible courage in obvious forms. But Phyllis Latour's courage was invisible. That was the entire point. Her bravery was not in the firefight or the rooftop chase. It was in showing up every single day and doing the work while looking like she was doing nothing at all. It was in the discipline to keep fear from reaching her face. It was in the patience to sit at a transmitter for 10 minutes and send a perfect message under conditions that would have made most people's hands shake so badly they could not have operated the key. This is a kind of strength that we do not celebrate enough. The quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that shows up and does what needs to be done without asking for recognition or acknowledgement, that keeps going not because it is glamorous but because it matters. We have a cultural habit, especially in the stories we tell about war, of celebrating the things that are visible. The charge across the beach, the dogfight at 30,000 feet, the battlefield's surrender. These things deserve to be celebrated. They were hard and costly, and they mattered. But the invisible work, the patient, grinding, daily invisible work of the people behind the lines, is what made all of those visible moments possible. Without the intelligence gathered and transmitted by people like Phyllis Latour, D-Day would have looked different. The Allied commanders planning the invasion needed to know what was on those beaches, what forces were positioned where, whether the German panzer divisions were near enough to be a problem in the crucial early hours. That information did not materialize out of thin air. It was gathered by agents cycling through Norman hedgerows and transmitted from barns and ditches and lofts in 10-minute bursts and carried in bamboo knitting needles past German checkpoints. That is the invisible infrastructure of victory, and it was built and maintained by people like Phyllis Latour, who understood that the unglamorous work was the essential work. She never needed anyone to tell her that. She just knew it, and she did it anyway, and then she went home and planted a garden in New Zealand and let the world get on with forgetting about her. But you know what? The world does not get to forget. Not while this channel is here. Not while there are people like you willing to sit down and listen to a story that deserves to be remembered. That is why we are here. That is why this matters. And that is why stories like the one you just heard need to keep being told until the name Phyllis Latour is as well known as any general, any admiral, any fighter pilot. She earned it 10 times over. Let me put the broader context around Phyllis Latour's story, because I think it helps you understand not just what she did, but how rare it was. The SOEF section sent roughly 400 agents into France over the course of the war. Of those, about a quarter were women. These women came from all walks of life, teachers and secretaries and nurses and students and farmers' daughters, and they were doing things that women had essentially never been asked to do in the history of organized warfare. They were not supporting the war effort from behind the lines. They were behind enemy lines, alone, in a foreign country, carrying weapons and codes and radios, doing the same work the male agents were doing and taking the same risks. Not all of them made it home. Some of them, caught by the Gestapo, were sent to concentration camps. Some were executed. Some simply disappeared, and their families received nothing but silence for years after the war, sometimes for decades, waiting for answers that never came in any complete form. The bravery of these women was not hypothetical. It was paid for in very real terms by the ones who did not survive. Phyllis Latour survived, but she carried the knowledge that the women in the cells next to hers did not, that survival was not a product of being better or smarter or braver, just of being luckier on certain afternoons when a van did not take a particular road, when an informant did not happen to be watching, when a sergeant held a bamboo needle and did not think to look inside. In the SOE's F section, which was the primary circuit operating in France during the war, it is estimated that roughly 1 in 4 agents was killed or captured. Many of the wireless operators did not come home. Some were betrayed by informants, some were caught by the direction-finding units, some were swept up in Gestapo raids, some simply ran out of luck. The margin between survival and capture was often razor-thin, often a matter of one decision made differently on one otherwise ordinary afternoon. Phyllis Latour made the right decisions. Every time. For 4 months straight. under conditions that few of us will ever face, and even fewer of us would have survived with our freedom and our lives intact. And here is the part I keep coming back to when I think about her story. You can look at what she did and focus on the dramatic moments, the knitting needle, the 3 searches, the moment a German sergeant held the bamboo tube with the silk codes inside and put it back down. Those moments are genuinely remarkable. But what impresses me more, honestly, is the other 99%. The days when nothing dramatic happened. The morning she woke up in a farmhouse under a false name in an occupied country and did all the small, necessary, invisible things required to maintain her cover for another 24 hours. The afternoon she sat in someone's kitchen, needles clicking, making small talk about the weather and the food rationing while processing in the back of her mind exactly where she needed to be at what time to make her next scheduled transmission. The night she lay in a narrow bed listening to German soldiers' voices in the street below and simply waited for quiet so she could sleep. That is what sustained courage actually looks like. Not the moment of crisis, the 10,000 quiet hours in between crises, when you could have decided it was not worth it, when you could have found a reason to stop, when you could have let the fear win. She never did, not once in 4 months. She never bragged about it. There is a detail from her later life that I keep coming back to. After she became publicly known in New Zealand, local commemorations and events sometimes featured her. Veterans' gatherings, school visits, that sort of thing. And by all accounts, she was gracious and warm and willing to talk about what she had done, but she always made a point of saying that she was not exceptional. She always said that there were many others who did what she did, who made the same choices, who took the same risks, and who did not survive. She said it was important to remember them too, because the ones who did not come home could not tell their own stories, and someone needed to tell those stories for them. That is exactly what we try to do on this channel. We tell the stories of the people who cannot tell them anymore, the women who jumped out of planes over occupied France at age 22, the teenagers who hid Jewish children in potato sheds, the wireless operators who transmitted from hedgerows while direction-finding vans circled the countryside looking for them, the women who are represented by a single line in a history book, if they are represented at all. If you are still here, you already understand why this channel exists, and I am grateful for that. But if you have not subscribed yet, I am going to ask you one more time, do it now. Not because I need the numbers, because these stories deserve an audience, because the people who lived them deserve to be remembered by more people than a handful of dedicated historians. You being here, you watching this, you sharing this with someone you know, that is how we honor them. That is how we make sure that Phyllis Latour Doyle is not forgotten again. Tap subscribe. Leave a comment. Share this video with someone who loves this kind of history. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. Now, final thoughts. There is a phrase that comes up sometimes in discussions of the SOE agents, particularly the women. People describe them as ordinary women doing extraordinary things. I understand why people say that. I know what they mean by it. But I want to push back on it a little because I think it actually undersells what these women were. Phyllis Latour was not ordinary. She spoke 2 languages fluently at a native level. She could fly a plane. She was one of the fastest and most accurate Morse code operators in her training group. She had the psychological makeup to maintain a cover identity for months under active enemy pressure. She had the discipline to suppress fear on demand. She had the creativity to solve the problem of where to hide her codes in a way that would not occur to anyone searching her. The ordinary woman framing is well-intentioned, but it does something a little bit subtle that I think is worth naming. It implies that what these women did could have been done by anyone, that it was mostly just circumstance and luck. And I do not think that is true. Yes, these women were not superhuman. Yes, they had fears and doubts and hard days like everyone else. Yes, their bravery was not the kind that comes from being fearless, but the kind that comes from choosing to act despite fear. In that sense, yes, it is accessible, it is human, it is something we can connect to. But it was not ordinary. Phyllis Latour was exceptional. She was exceptionally skilled, exceptionally disciplined, exceptionally brave, and exceptionally committed to something she believed mattered more than her own safety. That is not ordinary. That is extraordinary. And calling it ordinary, even with the best intentions, is a way of not quite seeing her fully. She deserves to be seen fully. She hid the D-Day codes in a knitting needle. The Germans searched her 3 times and found nothing. She transmitted more than 200 messages from occupied Normandy. She came home. She raised a family. She lived to be 102 years old, and she never once said it was exceptional. But it was. It absolutely was. Phyllis Latour Doyle was a remarkable woman. Full stop. No qualifications, no minimizing. A remarkable woman who did a remarkable thing during one of the darkest and most consequential periods in modern history, and who then went home and raised her kids and tended her garden and let most of the world forget that she had ever been anything other than a neighbor, a grandmother, an old lady in New Zealand. We should not forget. This was the story of Phyllis Latour Doyle, SOE Agent F Section. Codename Genevieve, wireless operator of the Normandy Resistance, keeper of the D-Day codes, the woman who looked a dozen German soldiers in the eye while the secrets of the invasion sat in her knitting basket and never once flinched. I hope you remember her name. If you liked this video, please subscribe. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories of the women who helped shape the outcome of World War II, stories that have been overlooked, undervalued, and in some cases almost completely forgotten. Every time you subscribe, every time you share one of these videos, you are helping make sure these stories reach the people who need to hear them. It means the world to us, and it honors the people we are telling these stories about. See you in the next one.